Hello and welcome to the Other Minds podcast. I'm Joseph Bohigian. Other Minds, founded in 1992 in San Francisco by Charles Amerkanian and Jim Newman, is devoted to championing the most original voices in new and experimental music. On season 5 of the podcast, we're talking with a range of composers, performers, and authors across the field of new music, including the featured composers from the 30th Other Minds Festival, which will take place October 8th to 11th, 2026 at the Brava Theater in San Francisco. My guest today is Marina Peterson. Peterson is Professor of Anthropology at the University of Texas at Austin. Her work has an emphasis on sound and urbanism, and she is the author of the 2021 book, Atmospheric Noise: The Indefinite Urbanism of Los Angeles, which examines ways in which environmental noise, atmosphere, sense, and matter cohere through noise pollution legislation and the politics of airport noise from the 1960s to the present. Peterson will speak about her work at Other Minds' The Nature of Music on Wednesday, September 9th, 2026 at the David Brower Center in Berkeley. Welcome to the podcast, Marina.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So what drew you to sound as a focus of your anthropological research?
I guess my background as a cellist mainly, and thinking about how to incorporate that and sustain that and the kind of, what I knew from that and through that in my investigation of cities. So initially, then that broadly. And that was a moment, though, before sound studies really existed. So my first book was on downtown public concerts and more kind of related to music and musical performance and questions about ways that, sort of global neoliberal city was being performed through these kind of world music concerts, mostly world music.
This concept of noise pollution that you write about in your book, how old is that idea of noise pollution, and when did it become a problem that needed to be solved through legislation?
In my book and in this project, I trace the history of, or the emergence of the category of noise pollution as it kind of became a legislative problem in the U.S. And there is a specificity to the American case or American version of it. I think that there are other histories, there are European histories especially, and Asian histories actually that are slightly different and have a kind of different valence. But in the U.S., noise pollution emerged as a problem in the environmental movement in the late 50s, 60s, and was sort of really marked as such. And I trace the emergence of it as something that was named from something that was a interior or a concern of sort of interior spaces and interior environments, and something that was marked by people in the building industry to an environmental problem that was the outdoors. And it really was coterminous with environmentalism. And so more broadly, and then got packaged with legislation, in that way, and got packaged with the Clean Air Act, which actually is a little bit mysterious, but also gives it a particular valence, I think.
So what qualifies something as pollution in terms of noise? Is it just unwanted sound?
Partly unwanted sound, but then I think also interestingly, I found at least one, discussion of noise pollution as unwanted sound as really meaning the standards definition, or referring to the standards definition. And standards have their own history also, right? And so again, that's sort of like, it's not just a generic neutral definition. It's something that was doing a particular kind of work to standardize what noise would mean and was coming out of communication. And I think especially, I guess other parts of this research that are not so much in this book, but things, related to, especially to research for the military and in terms of like communication and audibility of people in airplanes. And there's a little bit in here, but it's not as foregrounded. But I think, so this, and then also telephone communication. And so unwanted sound, right? Like noise as unwanted sound isn't necessarily something loud at that, right? If that's what the definition is, it's, it's like all the little buzzes and hisses and all the little, like, anything that's sort of like any kind of interference. So, it's interesting because then noise as unwanted sound gets circulated and taken up as this, I think, more recently in terms of a sense that being unwanted is something that's personal. And so it's the person's response, an individual's response. And so it starts to be a way of saying that it's subjective and not actually a kind of, agreed upon standard, I guess. And maybe that shifts, especially as maybe in that conflation of thinking about municipal noise and noise in cities and as being something that's loud. And that has another, this history of municipal ordinances that's different than environmental legislation, actually, or regulation.
Could you talk about the Los Angeles International Airport Noise Abatement Zone and this idea that it's the maybe government or municipality's responsibility to mitigate noise, urban noise?
Yeah, so airports were really central to the history of the category of noise pollution and legislation around noise pollution. So they, I think, in some way were the test case and the site where a lot of the metrics were both developed and then tested and mitigated. I mean, interestingly, also there's sort of the same cast of characters doing this work. So Leo Baranek and his firm and people associated with that were actually doing all sides of that work.
Can you explain who he is?
He was a acoustic, well, actually, and he's pretty significant for the history of experimental music and contemporary composition because he actually invented the anechoic chamber. And so he actually made the one at Harvard that John Cage went into, and then, has this apocryphal statement of, what he heard two sounds. And so there's no such thing as silence. But anyway, it was made to test the speakers for the Ghost Army. And Leo Baranek was hired to do that. And he also was involved in kind of innumerable aspects of noise mitigation and the development of metrics. And I think, that's an interesting kind of confluence, right? Of actually, and then he or people from his firm were testifying at legislative hearings. And so they were kind of, I think, doing a lot of work of constructing what this thing noise is and in terms of the metrics of it. Noise abatement zone, is these kind of, they make these maps of where the sound pressure level is high or, is on average, I don't know, I can't remember, like 65 dBA, let's say, for over a year or something. That those are shifting. I think they're different in different locations, but, they kind of end up with these really interesting sort of gradated maps, these like radiating, not circles there, it's where it depends on where the flight paths are. And so, when it's like, there's some level, I think 65, and then it drops to 50 or 35, and the residents, different things happen actually. So one is a lot of the area might be rezoned, and so and reclassified in terms of zoning. So then the use changes, and it changes from being residential to hotels and rental car area, and then at LAX, the area west of the runways where the homes were purchased and removed with the idea that it would be maybe a golf course or maybe hotels, which I think is what happened in a lot of the areas. But then somebody found an endangered species of butterfly, and so now nothing can happen there. But otherwise, maybe you get soundproofing in another kind of area, and better windows, and so there's this whole set, I guess, of it's regulatory.
You mentioned earlier the idea of noise pollution sort of being in the ear of the beholder, and I thought it was interesting that some people accepted the changes to their houses to make it more soundproof. Some people said, no, I don't want to get rid of my nice wooden windows, so I'm going to leave it as it is. Some people resisted having to leave their home. So could you talk about all these sort of different reactions that people have to the idea of noise in the environment?
Yeah, I guess in a way, like putting it that way is the way that actually, say, FAA officials or the airport officials like to put it, like that it turns it into a kind of a subjective experience. I guess, and against maybe something like a noise abatement zone, which generalizes, right? Which suggests that, in fact, generalizes so much that, you can't really even connect those numbers to anybody's experience, because any single event just gets fed into some kind of like it's over the course of, so many, like this decibel level over the course of a year averaged, right? So it gets averaged to like to such an extent that there's nothing specific. Maybe more interesting is now when these things have been kind of sorted out seemingly, and they're regulated, they're set in place, and because the airport is doing what it's supposed to do to like do the regulatory work, when people are bothered by it, they don't really have much to push back against or a way to push back against it. And so then the interaction becomes the airport officials going out and explaining to somebody, no, but what you heard was allowed. Look, this flight path is like, that's the norm. And it's already, in the system. And then I guess like historically, the question of people who didn't want to move, are attached to homes. I think that's probably, it's maybe, I would say, I guess I was going to say it's normal, but also it's also maybe also privileged, actually, right? Like, so the people I'd met who lived in that area of the west of the runway it was like a, development that was made for movie stars and millionaires initially, and then they built homes on the dunes, so they have views of the ocean. It was kind of this like paradise in the city right next to the airport, or became the airport, or became international airport. And so if you have your sort of dream house, and then right, the airport's telling you to move, but you decide you prefer to have the view over having the over caring about the noise, I guess, or whatever, or caring about the airport lanes. Or also, I think there was a lot of mobilization against the airport at that point, and by people who were in a position to mobilize. What shifts is then, the neighborhoods around the airport that are really under the flight path are not, upper middle class white neighborhoods anymore. And that's kind of also, I think, generalizable to an extent, at least.
This idea of noise pollution from infrastructure is, again, becoming an issue with data centers that are popping up all over the place. Have you done any research on that, or know anything about any legislation around that or pushback to it?
No, in Texas, it seems to be that certain similar kinds of things, like in terms of the way that, people rely on that for like the local economy or that their jobs, but also there's a lot of, there is actually a lot of pushback in Texas. That's kind of like where a lot of these are being built, and they're taking the water and the.
Well, and also it's private industry as opposed to an airport, right? So is there a difference there?
I don't know, actually. It's private industry, but it's allowed by a municipality usually. And I think, there was just recently in San Marcos, just south of Austin, the city actually voted to not allow data centers, also because of community mobilization and protest and knowing what's happening at other places. I think water actually is the biggest issue with these in Texas. Noise, there are other, there's something like the wind turbines and a flicker effect, or also people complain about noise with wind turbines, which I think becomes actually in some ways complicated in terms of the kind of, I guess, right, like clean energy, right, and the support for that. On the one hand, and then individuals who experience something like this flashing light inside their homes, but in some ways maybe it's not as like a dense, there's not a kind of density of population density, I guess that.
Does this idea of noise pollution overlap with the idea of environmental noise, or is that thought to be more natural sounds, or is it being encroached on by urban sounds?
Oh, that's an interesting way of putting that. So I think environmental noise was really used as part of describing what noise pollution was in that work toward legislating around noise pollution and regulating something that was being called noise pollution. And part of that, from what I understand, is the way that it was curtailed to airborne sound historically. So now not necessarily as much, but for various reasons. Maybe partly the role of the airport. For what I've I guess from what I found, partly the role of the airport and the fact that what people were hearing and responding to and complaining about was largely airborne sound. And I'm sort of bracketing, I mean, because there is this whole case of vibration and people complaining about, the tiles are falling off their walls. And that was absolutely part of it. But I think another side of that then was, and I have a footnote about it, but that the EPA and NOAA were both founded at the same time, or by Nixon actually, but they were doing, and they had kind of different jurisdictions. And so the EPA, where the noise pollution legislation was enacted, or through, or that it oversaw the noise pollution legislation as part of the Clean Air Act amendments, was responsible for air, water, and soil pollution. And so noise pollution was discussed in relation to air rather than other spaces or other kinds of, I guess, material or environmental forms. And so something like vibration that maybe one would be also entail the ground or entail, I mean, actually, I guess that, there's a way that could have come into that, but because it was discussed in relation to air pollution, it cast, I guess, environmental noise as this very specific, as something that you hear that comes in the air. Ask me that question again, though, because I'm sort of getting astray now. Because
just whether there's a distinction between noise pollution and environmental noise, and whether environmental noise deals more in the natural world than the built environment, and how those are interacting.
I'm sort of wondering what it evokes for you, because I'm thinking, what I'm also thinking about is R. Murray Schafer, actually, and his work. I mean, how much of his work was motivated by also being concerned with noise pollution and environment, and the way that cast, noise as something that's industrial and urban, as apart from and distinct from nature. Right?
Yeah, and this idea kind of leads me into something I've been thinking about that you, I think, mentioned in some of our communications about your talk, which is how our understanding of environmental noise helps us understand something like the human impact on climate change.
Yeah, I mean, I guess so. Environmental, but I guess I'm still thinking about what this term. I mean, I know I use environmental noise, but when I looked just now to see exactly how I was using it, since you said it, it's like it's other people's use of it. It's like it's quoting from legislators or quoting from like regulatory documents, and so I think it's also it's sort of emerging as a category. The way that environmental noise, I mean, actually, it still gets kind of classified as, or understood as, being about the air and something that we hear from the air as sound in the air. And so things like the shipping or something isn't included, and vibration isn't included. In terms of thinking about climate change, I think I've been thinking about that in different ways, and not one, actually pushing back a little bit in terms of thinking that, noise is a kind of index of climate change, and so when there's less, say, sort of infrastructural sound, that means that there is sort of less human impact. I think it's interesting. That work is interesting, and I mean, Bernie Krause has this kind of the niche, the acoustic niche work that, it's showing what it shows. It's showing that there is this, relationship between, say, cars and human or anthropogenic sound and non-human species, and the kind of ways that they make, I guess, sound. But I think that there's more to it, and it's I'm thinking of two things. One is, when I teach this and teach World Soundscape Project and acoustic ecology and the notion of soundscape, and how the notion of soundscape actually came out of noise pollution mobilization, that there's this image, and you probably know this, of the 24 hours, and they graphed the different things that were audible and the decibel levels. So you see airplanes and then the airplanes fall off in the night. But when my students look at them and they say, oh, but actually the frogs get louder when the airplanes are there. So actually there's also that happening somehow, this, right? And so not just that they get drowned out, but actually that they don't exist anymore or something, or that they lose their habitat, but actually that there's this other kind of relationship or acoustic relationship happening. And then I guess the other is something, I was thinking about during the pandemic when it was very quiet. It was or the cars, people weren't driving, and there was intense kind of decrease in anthropogenic sound. And a lot, I think that got read as, oh, and now the birds are louder, right? And so because the anthropogenic sound is less, and so they've been able to come into audibility, and they're now like able to fill, or they're I don't know what, happier. They're like, I don't know, right? Yeah. But then also, and that somehow that's an index of kind of the problem of anthropogenic sound, or of, I guess, environmental noise, but also thinking about how that silence actually is the silencing of anthropogenic sound because of the pandemic is really in some ways that's the index of the Anthropocene, or of, given that the pandemic, or the, COVID is a kind of anthropogenic condition. And so to not take for granted, I guess, this a kind of duality, or the kind of opposition of environmental sound and anthropogenic noise, or something like that, right?
You mentioned Armory Schaefer earlier, and I'm wondering if you can talk about creative or compositional use of environmental noise, environmental sound, something like field recording. It reminded me of something you wrote in your book, which really stuck out to me, which was that listening is compositional.
Yeah, and maybe I'll come at that also in terms of what we were talking about before about microphone listening and about making recordings. As part of the research on airport noise, the kind of way that the microphone, the transparency of the microphone, and the way that use of a microphone is important for both measuring and recording airborne sound became very palpable to me. And so the way the microphone is invisible, or becomes invisible, in both of these uses. And so I made wind noise recordings to push back against that transparency, to kind of think with the ways, that one, right, the microphone is rendered transparent in so many uses, both in terms of making field recordings, and maybe especially in terms of making field recordings, but also, when it's mounted on a pole next to the runway and is measuring the volume of the jet engine as it, is departing, that's also, it's not, it has a windscreen on it, actually, that also, and I can tell you where they are. They're interesting. It's sort of like if you're like walking around LAX, it's like, oh, and it's like, and maybe I would say in terms of that, what you said, that listening is compositional, that for me, actually making those wind noise recordings was very sort of palpably compositional and kind of improvisatory. And it felt very much akin to actually improvising, doing kind of sound-based improvisation on cello, and especially, with other musicians, and that in this genre where we, compose as we play, and that the wind was really doing this kind of improvisation. And so I was, really listening for a kind of arc. It was, I think they're all kind of about 6 minutes long, but there was kind of this sense that something happened, and then the kind of composition concluded, and it was a place to end. And
yeah, you said something interesting, if I'm remembering correctly, that those recordings are not necessarily recordings of the wind, it's recordings of the wind's impact on the microphone, right, which I thought was a really interesting way to think about it.
Yeah, and some people do make recordings of the wind, the sound of the wind, right? Like the kind of as our ears hear them, but there's a lot of work involved in doing that to make sure that the wind doesn't do this other thing that it also does on microphones all the time, right? And all the little crackles and pops, and so to actually, right, to push the gain until you get those crackles and pops, and so it's really this other thing. It's some kind of touch, right? It's some kind of, and also this internal mechanism of a microphone and the device, the recording device, and a kind of, it's not feedback proper, but it's something internal happening in the device. It's not, and rather than it actually being the sound of wind, but it's what we understand also. I mean, it's what happens to a microphone when the wind, right, is too hot, strong.
But I mean, it sounds like there's a lot of composition that went into the making of those recordings.
Yeah.
Thinking probably about what type of microphone, how you're positioning it, like the gain, like you mentioned.
Yeah. And actually what I found was that the built-in microphones on a Zoom were the best.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Why do you think that is?
I don't know. I mean, better than using an external microphone. I mean, I wonder if I actually don't know enough about technically how those, what about those microphones. I mean, maybe they're worse microphones, or maybe actually a microphone. I think they're actually unshielded in a way that when you have a microphone, like most microphones are shielded in some way.
I should say this is like a Zoom portable recorder, not a Zoom video conferencing technology.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah. So like these, this, like you take them, like most microphones, I think what I was taking out have some kind of shielding on them.
Right.
And so I couldn't get it to be disturbed in the same.
And I mean, when I'm setting up the microphones for recording like this, I'm trying to angle it so that we're not getting, the air sounds coming out of our mouths, and really you're making all of those things that I'm trying to edit out present.
Right.
In these recordings.
And all of that happened with these the history of these vocal microphones also, right? To find ways to not have all the pops, and also the way that, certain voices are more amenable to being recorded by them. And
yeah. You can hear Marina Peterson speak at The Nature of Music on Wednesday, September 9th, 2026 at 7:30 p.m. at the David Brower Center in Berkeley. Thank you, Marina, for joining me today, and thanks everyone for listening.
Thank you.
This has been an episode of the Other Minds podcast, brought to you by Other Minds. Our 30th festival is October 8th to 11th, 2026, at the Brava Theater in San Francisco. We'll be back next week with a series of interviews with the OM30 composers, so join us then.